From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Oh, nobody here. Good afternoon. All right, there we go. That's the kind of spirit we need here on the Mall for this wonderful National Book Festival. So on behalf of the Library of Congress, I would like to welcome you to the 2013 National Book Festival. My name is Milton Coleman. I'm a former senior editor of the Washington Post, now a contributing editor, which means they pay for my cell phone. And it is my pleasure to be here today. We being the Washington Post as well as the Library of Congress, hope you are having a wonderful day today celebrating the joy of reading here on the National Mall. Now, I have something wonderfully in common with the author I'm about to introduce. He is a professor at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and I am a graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And it used to be that the former Milwaukee State Teachers College, which became the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, when people would say, where'd you go to school at? I'd say the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, which should not be confused with the real University of Wisconsin in Madison. But to our credit at UWM, we now have become so big that people from the Madison campus have to say they're from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, as opposed to the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. So hooray for us, you know, that's the thread we have in common. But we have another thread in common, which is more important, and that is this. The legendary former editor of the Washington Post, Ben Bradley, once said that news is the first rough draft of history. News is the first rough draft of history. On this, the 50th anniversary of the historic March on Washington, my colleague Bob Kaiser wrote in the Post that our newspaper blew it during the March on Washington. We barely mentioned this guy named M.L. King Jr., as he was called then, and we didn't even quote the I Have a Dream section of the speech. So comes now William P. Jones with another draft of history that corrects a lot of the record and seeks to explain more the history of leading up to that event, which we have memorialized in this, the 50th year of that day in August of 1963. Our author is himself not just a historian, but he's an expert on labor patterns and other things that should be of great interest to us now, because within the next 10 days, we could see a major labor shutdown if the government shuts down. And he talks about the desire that the originators of the march had to get the federal government into fair employment practices, which later combined with the activist surge to put more emphasis on freedom. And he also talks about the record of the civil rights movement as it really was, not as we have come to understand it in a somewhat distorted way. So, ladies and gentlemen, he's going to speak for probably about 35 minutes, and then he will be glad to answer your questions. It is with great honor and pleasure that I introduce to you the author of the March on Washington, Jobs, Freedom, and the Forgotten History of Civil Rights, Mr. William P. Jones.
Thanks for all of you for coming out and listening to this. I'm going to put these down so I don't knock them off. It's really great to be able to talk about this book here, where the event that I describe and try to make sense of really occurred just over there. And it's also great to be able to talk about it on this 50th anniversary of this march, in which I think there's been a lot of really interesting and important speculation, both about the meaning of the march and the legacy of the march, and the degree to which we as a nation have lived up to the dream that was laid out so eloquently by the march and the organizers of the march. I didn't actually set out to write this book. I was actually doing research on what I thought would be a different book, and discovered a really fascinating collection of papers connected to the Negro American Labor Council. This is what I've started to call the lost civil rights organization. It's largely forgotten. I knew something about it when I found this collection. It was it's fairly well known that the president of the Negro American Labor Council was A. Philip Randolph, the great African-American labor leader, who had actually first proposed a march on Washington 20 years earlier in 1941 to protest employment discrimination in the defense industries and segregation and discrimination in the armed forces. So I knew something about it, but I was surprised to discover that it was actually the organization that initiated and did much of the initial organizing for the March on Washington in 1963. Here was perhaps one of the greatest known and best known events in American history. And I, somebody who thought I knew something about American history, had no idea that this was really the organization that had started it. I discovered a number of things initially beyond that the original aim of the march, in the eyes of the Negro American Labor Council, was to address what they saw as a threat, an impending threat of unemployment in black communities, mostly in African American communities in the urban north. And they tied this to what they called at the time the automation of industry, the increasing use of technology in manufacturing, which, as they saw, was starting to eliminate the jobs that African Americans had started to get in the past 20 years, had really fought hard for these jobs in automobile plants, in steel mills, largely across the urban north. So the initial idea was actually to demand two things. One was a federal law banning employment discrimination. So they said, if these jobs that we're in now are going to be eliminated, we need the ability to move into higher skilled jobs, better paid jobs. And the federal government needs to ensure that ability. The other thing was to call for a broad federal jobs creation program aimed at eliminating unemployment for both black or white, workers of any race. And this discovery of these initial roots of this event that is so well known, yet I think largely misunderstood, led me to rethink not just the history of the march, but the history of what we now think of as the civil rights movement. The deep historical and institutional roots of the march, and the way that march was connected to a much longer history, starting not just in 1941 with the first idea for a March on Washington, but really going back into the early years of the 20th century. This helped me understand, I think, in a new way, the origins of the march, but also the purpose of the march, and I think probably most importantly, what it means to us today, 50 years later, and why we really, I think, need to know this complex history of the March on Washington. On one hand, this history helps us understand the tremendous size and power of the march that occurred in 1963, which is often, I think, seen as this sort of spontaneous event. Like Martin Luther King said, meet me at the Lincoln Memorial, and 250,000 people showed up. And there's no real sense of how does this actually happen? How do you get people to do that? This was on a Wednesday. Most of the people who attended this march were working people. They were factory workers, they were teachers, they were people who stopped their work, took a day off of work, and traveled to the nation's capital to participate in a political event. How do you get people to do that? There have actually been larger marches on Washington, but they almost always occur on a Saturday or a Sunday. How do you do that in the middle of the week? The Negro American Labor Council was a really critical and I think a forgotten link in this story. It was actually founded in 1960, but it drew on networks, personal networks and institutional networks that went back really to the labor uprisings of the 1930s and 1940s. Many of the people who were leaders of the Negro American Labor Council had worked with A. Philip Randolph to build the march in 1941 that was ultimately called off at the last minute. And they had always thought, someday we're going to redo this. So they really saw the 1963 march as a continuation of something that happened 20 years earlier. the Negro American Labor Council, when it is mentioned, is largely seen as some historians call it a paper organization, really something that A. Philip Randolph was the head of, but did not really have an organization behind it. In fact, there are a number of books that describe A. Philip Randolph as the only major civil rights leader who didn't have an organization. What I discovered from this collection was, in fact, the Negro American Labor Council was composed of several thousand black trade unionists in cities across the country, mostly in the urban north, stretching all the way from New York, Chicago, Detroit, to Los Angeles, some smaller branches in Atlanta, New Orleans, and southern cities. These people, it was a relatively small organization, but the people who belonged to it were really in critical positions. They were elected officials, staff members of local unions. Many of them were also presidents or officials of local civil rights organizations, so the branch of the NAACP in their city. And so as a result, they were really in a tremendous position to actually mobilize people, right? They represented far more than the small number would suggest. And they were really the people that laid the basis for this massive crowd that would show up in August of 1963. I also discovered an important root of the mobilization in black women's organizations. A key figure in this story is Anna Arnold Hedgeman, which again is somebody who's really one of the most important leaders of the civil rights movement and almost completely forgotten and left out of this history. She had worked with A. Philip Randolph in the 1940s to pass a federal law to end employment discrimination. And she was one of the first people that he turned to when he wanted to renew this march in 1963. And she did two things that were really critical, a really critical role. One, she encouraged him to reach out to the National Council of Negro Women, which at the time was actually the largest organization of African Americans. They had roughly 800,000 members, many of whom belonged to women's clubs in cities across the country. A. Philip Randolph did reach out to this organization, but he refused to do a really critical thing that Anna Hedgeman suggested, that he invite the leadership, primarily Dorothy Height, who was the president of the National Council of Negro Women, to be in the official leadership of this march. He refused to do that and actually set up a battle that would really be a critical battle, not just in the organization of the march, but I think in the emergence of feminism in the 1960s. And I address that in the book. I'd be happy to elaborate on that later. So Hedgeman was sort of partially successful in this one really critical intervention. The other, in which she was more successful, was that she was the person who actually encouraged A. Philip Randolph to reach out to Martin Luther King, the most prominent leader of the movement that had emerged in the South over the previous 10 years to battle segregation and disfranchisement in the South. A. Philip Randolph had very close connections to this southern wing of the civil rights movement, as did most of the members of the Negro American Labor Council. They had played really important roles in raising money for the movement that emerged in the 1950s. A. Philip Randolph actually played a very key strategic role in sending support, and also his protege, Bayard Rustin, who was the most important expert in the tactic of nonviolent civil disobedience, Gandhian nonviolence. Bayard Rustin actually went to Montgomery and taught Martin Luther King about this strategy that had first been implemented in the march in 1941. So these very important connections for, again, a movement that I think is fairly well known, but again, very deeply misunderstood. It was actually, so Anna Hedgeman set up a meeting between King and Randolph, and out of this meeting they said, well, let's not just march for jobs, let's have a march for jobs and freedom. And this is where the slogan of the 1963 march comes from. And again, I think becomes really critical for the success of that mobilization that is often taken for granted. It was the link between these roughly northern and southern wings of the black freedom struggle that really came together to make this a tremendous and a historic event. So in addition for understanding why this was such a powerful and successful march, I think it helps us understand the goals of the march, which from the very beginning were legal equality for African Americans coupled with economic justice for all Americans. And the principal idea that those two things would never happen in isolation, that the two always had to happen together. It was about jobs and freedom. A. Philip Randolph set this out very clearly in the opening address to the official program at the Lincoln Memorial. So I think most of us know this event through Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. The first speech at that event was given by A. Philip Randolph, who, remember, at the time, he was actually the most important and widely recognized civil rights leader. He was known as the Dean of Black Leadership. And he was widely known, particularly for people who would have been there. They would have known that he had started this thing back 20 years earlier. And he very clearly said, this civil rights revolution is not confined to the Negro, nor is it confined to civil rights. For our white allies know that they cannot be free while we are not. And we know that we have no future in a society in which 6 million black and white people are unemployed and millions more live in poverty. And one thing that I think is really remarkable about this speech, one is it's a tremendous speech, and I actually encourage you, if you're not familiar with it, it's available online, but largely, again, unknown. But the way in which A. Philip Randolph set the tone for the other speakers that day, who largely echoed his point of the connection between economic justice and racial equality, the importance of full employment for everybody, decent employment, decent wages, connected to these demands for racial equality and sort of constitutional equality. And I think it's actually important for understanding the speech that we do know, Martin Luther King's speech, the I Have a Dream speech, which I think for many reasons is well known around the world. I actually had the experience of spending the past spring in Peru, and I was in a small town in Peru walking down the street and looked up, and there's a picture of Martin Luther King, and it was an ad for the I Have a Dream English school. And I thought, what is going on here? And I actually asked around, and people said, well, yeah, actually, a lot of people use the text of that speech to teach people English, because it's such a powerful piece of rhetoric, right? And it's such a powerful thing. But here, really, in Arequipa, Peru, which is a relatively small town, people are learning English, learning about the United States through this speech. And I think, any of us who are familiar with the speech, we know why. It's a tremendously powerful speech. But I think it's important to keep in mind the context in which it was delivered. Martin Luther King gave the last of 10 speeches. There were 10 speeches given on the stage. These were official speeches. There were also smaller speeches. People sang. It was the end of a 2-hour program. And by the time Martin Luther King came to the stage, there was no chance that anybody was there could have forgotten what the major goals of that march were. They had been laid out very clearly by A. Philip Randolph in his speech. They had been said over and over and over again by the other 8 speakers. And it's actually possible, I think, that by the time Martin Luther King got there, he felt that some of the things that were closest to him, the struggle for integration in the South, the struggle for voting rights in the South, may have actually been overshadowed by the goals of economic justice and job creation. Several of the speakers said, well, getting access to a restaurant doesn't really mean anything if you can't afford to eat there. Which is true, but I think downplays actually the significance of getting access to a restaurant. And I think it's possible that King might have thought by the time he got to the stage, he had to bring people back to the struggle in the South, which he did so powerfully. And he actually had a speech prepared that really emphasized this, again, this sort of dual agenda, this connection between economic justice. And he got halfway through that speech and threw out the text and went back to a speech that he had given very effectively several times, actually many times in the past 2 years. He actually first gave that I Have a Dream speech in 1961 to the AFL-CIO, the Executive Council of the AFL-CIO, the major labor federation. And this was a speech that was well known and very powerful, and he went back to that speech and gave it. And so I think by the time he got there, it was very hard for people to not know what this march was about. But I think if we only look at that speech, we get the sense that we get, I think, a narrow view of what the speech was about. Some actually noted the irony that Martin Luther King, who among the speakers, King had probably suffered the most directly. His house had been bombed several times. His family had been threatened. He had been physically assaulted several times. And the next day, a reporter for the New York Times said, you know, it's ironic that the guy who had suffered the most gave the most optimistic and the most reconciliatory speech, the speech that sort of said, we are actually going to live up to this dream, right? Our nation is going to fulfill its promise, and I have faith in that, right? And the New York Times reporter said, meanwhile, the other speakers concentrated on the struggle ahead and spoke in harsh and direct language about what was needed to be done. And I think, again, you know, we've taken the speech that is the optimistic one, but we've almost completely forgotten the other speeches. If anybody actually forgot what was happening that day and what it was all about, A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin came back to the stage right after King gave his speech and read the full demands of the march. They actually led everybody who was there in a mass pledge to go home and fulfill the goals of the march. One journalist remarked that when he gave that speech, all of the major national television networks had all of their television cameras trained on Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph. This was actually one of the first events that was broadcast through satellite television networks to Europe. And so Europeans saw this live also. And the New York Times reporter remarked that no message 1/10 so radical had ever been heard by so many Americans. And again, I think that's lost in the way in which we understand the memory of this march. I guess in ending, I want to just note the degree to which I think this longer history and this context is important for understanding what the meaning of the march is for us today, and the legacy that I hope we can take away from this really tremendous historical event. And to understand that context, I'll give you a little bit more context, is that 2 months before the March on Washington, so in June of 1963, President John F. Kennedy gave a tremendous speech on civil rights. He called a press conference. The context was that this was the week that the really horrific clashes that I think many of us are familiar with that occurred in Birmingham, Alabama, the scenes of children being attacked by police dogs, by fire hoses. These images, they related to protests that had just occurred. And it really pushed John F. Kennedy, a president who was rather reluctant to take on civil rights directly, and forced him to take this on. And he really rose to the occasion, I think. He gave a tremendous speech in which he said, the issue of racial equality is a moral issue, as old as the scriptures and as clear as the Constitution. And he called on Congress to pass a Civil Rights Act that would uphold that moral issue. In fact, 10 years before this, the U.S. Supreme Court had reached a similar verdict in the Brown decision, in which they ruled that legal segregation was a violation of the constitutional rights of African Americans. So I think it's important to keep in mind that the march occurred after those things happened. And the point was actually not to make a moral statement about the need for racial equality, which is, I think, the way in which we often remember it. In fact, the goals of the march included passing the Civil Rights Bill that Kennedy introduced in June of 1963, but more importantly, it said, we need a much more powerful bill than the one that Kennedy's talking about. And all of the things that were added to the bill as a result of the demands of the march were not about the sort of moral principle of racial equality. It was, how do you actually get there? How do you actually enforce this principle? So they said the federal government has to take strong responsibility for enforcing legal equality. They wanted to pass a federal law making it illegal to discriminate against somebody in employment on the basis of their race. They wanted to withdraw federal funding from any local governments that discriminated against their citizens in form of housing or schools. They wanted to desegregate every school in the country by the end of the year. They wanted to pass a voting rights law that would withdraw congressional representation in any state where people were denied the right to vote. So the issue was not about a moral statement, but about what are the legal policies that we need to make sure that this moral statement is upheld. They also wanted to address this issue of economic justice. In part, the employment discrimination law would do that, but they also wanted to raise the minimum wage. They wanted to raise the minimum wage to a level that would provide a family with the ability to reach a decent standard of living, which at the time they said would be roughly $2 an hour. In today's terms, that's about $14 an hour. They wanted to extend the minimum wage to cover agricultural workers, domestic workers, public employees, all of whom were excluded from the original federal minimum wage laws. And they wanted a federal job creation and training program that would put all unemployed workers, black or white, in meaningful and dignified jobs at a living wage. So they wanted to eliminate unemployment. Now, I think we can see a number of respects in which these demands were met. In the law that was passed in 1964, what became the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there was Title VII, which made it illegal to discriminate in employment on the basis of race, color, nationality, religion, or sex. And the gender discrimination component was actually an important part of an outgrowth of the debate that emerged as a result of Dorothy Height not being included in the official leadership of the march. She and a number of women, including Anna Hedgeman, decided after the march that they could no longer take the position that ending discrimination on the basis of race would be enough to end discrimination against black women. And they said that black women need to also ensure an end to discrimination based upon gender. And this was actually, again, a really important moment in the emergence of the feminist movement in the 1960s. So in many respects, some of those demands were met. Obviously, a number of them were not. We still obviously have very high levels of unemployment. The minimum wage still is far behind what they were, the standard that they were calling for. In fact, in 1970s, they actually raised the minimum wage to $2 an hour. But by that point, it was about 10 years later. And since then, the value of the minimum wage has actually declined precipitously from the point at which they were actually trying to push it up. There is actually a movement afoot to try to raise the minimum wage now. Some people propose a $15 minimum wage, which is roughly equivalent to what they were calling for back in 1963. I think the important thing, I think, I want to leave you with is the context, I think, today, particularly in terms of the recent Supreme Court decisions this past summer. In two cases, the Supreme Court, actually 3 cases, the Supreme Court, I think, directly ruled on the legacy of the March on Washington. These had to do with affirmative action, voting rights, and employment discrimination. And in all 3 cases, the Supreme Court upheld the moral value of racial equality. So in all cases, the Supreme Court majority said, we believe in, that everybody has a right to be treated equally, regardless of their race, that these are consistent beliefs with the U.S. Constitution. And then in every case, the Supreme Court turned around and eliminated the enforcement measures that were deemed necessary to uphold that moral commitment. And I think in many ways we can see the same debate that we saw in 1963, which again is not really about a moral statement, but it's actually how do you achieve racial equality in reality. I think we often are tempted to see the March on Washington as the end of a struggle, one in which ended the system of segregation and legalized racial equality in the South. And I think we should remember it that way. That is a tremendous victory. But I think we also need to understand that it was in many ways the beginning of a struggle over what the reality in a complex international economy is for actually achieving equality before the law. Thank you. So I think we have 10 minutes. Is that right? Yeah. So I'd be happy to take questions. Yes.
Hey, Professor Jones, I've read Garrow's book, Burying the Cross. I've read Taylor Branch's book. There's a story that I think was in Taylor Branch's book about and there are hundreds of stories of how he changed his mind and gave the I Have a Dream speech. Yeah. There was a story that when they were doing this, the Kennedy family brought them in and said, hey, we're behind you, but don't make it too long and keep it short. And the Lewis story earlier. Okay, and so the story I think in Taylor Branch was that he had a speech and he gave it because Kennedy said to go short. He turned around and he said, Mahalia Jackson turned him around and said, Martin, go tell them about your dream. Is that true or?
I actually argue pretty strongly in the book against the idea that the Kennedy administration had a very direct hand in sort of shaping the march. I think they tried that. They were largely unsuccessful. And I think actually the John Lewis speech is actually a good example of that, in fact, in which I point out that John Lewis gave a remarkably radical speech, right. And one that even he says the message was not changed. The story that I've heard about Mahalia Jackson is that she was sitting behind him. She sang before him, and she was sitting behind him, saying, Martin, tell him about the dream, tell him about the dream. And that was right about the moment that he threw away his scripted speech. Apparently, his advisors told him, don't give the I Have a Dream speech, because the night before they were talking about it, and he said, don't give that speech. You've given it too many times. It's kind of trite, and it won't, it's not appropriate for this really tremendous event. And so he decided not to, and then at the last minute sort of changed course. And a number of people heard Mahalia Jackson say this. He never talked about whether he heard her. It's not clear whether he heard her, but a number of people say he must have heard her. They had a very close relationship, Mahalia Jackson and Martin Luther King, and so it's likely that he would have listened to her. She certainly knew about how to gauge an audience, as he did, right? And I think he sort of felt, this speech that was very kind of well scripted and really sort of confined to the sort of the general message of the march wasn't really going over that well, and he shifted into this speech that he knew, I think, and a lot of people knew that it was the one to give.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for sharing this really important research and writing that you've done. I wanted to ask more about kind of the gender versus race issues and Dorothy Hyde and the National Council of Negro Women and her interaction with A. Philip Randolph. I just was wondering whether or not your book or you have insight. Was there an ideological difference or a personal difference in terms of approach? Or was it more that A. Philip Randolph hewed to kind of the lesser role of women that was, part of, the way people thought back in that day? And if the latter, how did he express this?
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, in some ways, A. Philip Randolph was really remarkable in the degree to which he really, I think, appreciated and relied upon women's leadership. So, you know, Anna Hedgeman, for example, he asked Anna Hedgeman to be the executive director of the National Council for Permanent FEPC in 1945, out of recognition of her tremendous organizing ability, the connection that she had. And he didn't say, I want you to organize this and I'll be the head of it. He put her in the official leadership position, and he did that repeatedly. I think in some ways it was an ideological position that A. Philip Randolph shared with many of the women involved. And it was when they were talking about employment discrimination, often they believed that the problem was not just access to jobs, but it was the inability of black men to get jobs that could support their families completely, right? And this was a position that was shared by most labor activists in the early 20th century United States, many civil rights leaders. They said, what we need to do is get the black men the ability to earn a job where their wife doesn't need to go into the labor market, their children don't go into the labor market, because the reality was that entire black families were working, right? And so many black women shared this view. And in fact, Dorothy Height in 1962 wrote a very powerful paper about the primary issue here is getting good jobs for black men, and that's what we want. I think the question was, and this was raised by a number of women very early on, was, all right, black women are already in the workforce, right? So they need better jobs. They need the ability to earn a family wage. They're often earning more than their husbands. And so how do we deal with this? Are we just going to walk away from these jobs, or are we going to fight for better jobs? And that was a debate that emerged within the movement. And many black women were conflicted over how to respond to this. It was actually Pauli Murray, who's a really important figure in this whole story, who early on said, this has got to end, and we need to fight sex discrimination as vehemently as we fight race discrimination. And she was actually the person who played a critical role in getting that sex discrimination ban added to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So I don't think it was so much, it was actually not an ideological division. It was really an ideological debate that many of the activists were sort of internally conflicted about. But it was women who really pushed that debate. And I think A. Philip Randolph came to accept it.
Hi.
I can't hear you. Yeah. Right. Well, that was a related debate over, and the position that A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin actually took was that women were represented by the men on the stage. So and lots of these organizations were predominantly women, and so they said, well, women are represented, and that was enough. They sort of evaded the question of what about the National Council of Negro Women, which was the biggest one, and played a really important role and didn't have an official leadership. So, but I think it was related. It was related in the sort of what the main goals of the movement were. Yeah.
Thanks for presenting your research. My question is, Dr. Height appears on the stage during the presentation, the march, and can you talk about how she operationally had an impact on the march and the National Council of Negro Women, and how she became known, even though you say she wasn't officially a part of the march. She became known as one of the Big Six. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. And part of the answer to that question is a very long history of the National Council of Negro Women supporting specifically the movements that A. Philip Randolph was initiating going back to the 1940s. And Dorothy Height actually played a really important role in connecting the National Council of Negro Women to the labor activism that A. Philip Randolph was connected with. So she, by 1963, she was very well known among all of the leaders of these movements. Her sitting on the stage was actually part of a compromise that resulted. There was actually a threat. So a number of women wanted to organize a protest against A. Philip Randolph and picket him when he spoke at the National Press Club. And this sort of led to a crisis and a compromise, which was to allow Dorothy Height and a number of other women to sit on the stage, to allow a woman to to speak briefly and introduce other women. So this was actually initially going to be Gloria Robinson, a SNCC activist, or Gloria Richardson, sorry, and then it became Daisy Bates. So Daisy Bates actually gave a speech in which she introduced Rosa Parks and a number of other women. So there was a sort of token chance for women to appear at the march, but not give an official march. But Dorothy Height actually called a meeting at the National Council of Negro Women at their headquarters the night of the march, so right after the march, at which a number of women started to, in a sense, plot a campaign to challenge discrimination sex discrimination within the movement. And she really played a pivotal role, I think, because she had often said, well, we can't allow this debate to harm the broader movement. And so she sort of couched her challenge until right after the march and after the march. And she talks about this in her memoir, that she and a number of other women said, this is enough. And from that moment on, they took a very direct role in challenging discrimination. Yeah.
I wanted to say something about, I came to Washington early in 1963 to join the Return Peace Corps volunteers at Cardozo High School. A lot of new programs were starting with Kennedy. And one of the feelings then and in the two marches this year was that building of beloved community. It sounds a little maybe, but something happens in those marches that you never had happened in your life. But secondly, after the march then in November, JFK was assassinated. 65, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, and Vietnam. So it's wonderful, an observation on this.
Yeah. Well, one of the best things about writing this book has been to talk to people about their own memories about the march. And one thing I've been struck by actually is meeting a number of people who I already knew, who were friends of mine, after I finished the book, said, oh yeah, I was there, and told me about their own experiences. And so people who are, dear friends of mine who I had no idea about this history. And I do think that experience of participating in, I think a lot of people at the time recognized that they were experiencing a revolutionary event and one that was really profound. And I think that's a rare experience one to have. I think in terms of assessing the impact and the legacy of the march, I've tried to balance. I think there's a tendency to point to the limitations of the progress and to. I think many people have concluded that the march really didn't do anything. And I think it's important to both recognize the limitations of that, but also to recognize that this was a revolutionary event, and it really did profoundly change our country in very positive ways. So I think it's perhaps impossible to do both at the same time, but I think we need to. There's one more question, and then we're out of town.
Thank you. I'm just curious, if Dr. King had given this speech several times, the Washington Post didn't cover it, when does it become the iconic speech that we now consider it?
Yeah, this is really important, I think, in understanding the legacy of the march. And it really is not until after Dr. King's death, his assassination in 1968. And in large part, I think, because it was such an optimistic speech, it was one that people could look back to at the moment of his assassination. It was the period in which many people felt that the objectives that had been laid out in 1963 had not been achieved. And so it was a hopeful message that I think that took on new meaning in that context. I think the one casualty of that is that I think it becomes the only way in which we understood the march. And so people had largely forgotten the march, and so rediscovered the speech. And I think it's actually remarkable that we remember a speech that was given, by a black radical 50 years ago, right? That in itself is remarkable, but we remember it in a way that I think loses the context in what was given. Yeah. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.